Elena Vasquez had bought the same six numbers every Tuesday and Friday for 11 years. Her mother's birthday, her father's birthday, the day she and Richard got married, the day their old house on Maple Street finally sold, and two numbers that meant nothing at all. Just the ones that felt lucky when she stood at the counter of the Gas and Go on Route 9, waiting behind truckers buying coffee and teenagers buying candy, feeling a little foolish every single time and doing it anyway. She never told Richard how much she spent. It wasn't much. $20 a week, money she folded out of her hairdressing tips before it ever touched their joint account. It was hers. A small private ritual in a marriage that had grown quiet and cold over the last few years. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful so much as it is a held breath. They still ate dinner together most nights. They still slept in the same bed. But somewhere along the way, the space between them had widened into something neither of them talked about, and Elena had learned to fill that space with small private things. The ticket was one of them. So was the notebook where she sketched the porch of a house she didn't own yet. So was the quiet hour she spent every Sunday morning with coffee and a book, pretending she didn't notice that Richard rarely asked what she was reading anymore. She thought sometimes about what it would take to leave. She never let the thought go very far. 19 years is a long time to build a life with someone, even a life that has gone quiet. And Elena was not a woman who walked away from things easily. She had stayed through his mother's illness, through 2 rounds of layoffs at the salon where she worked before opening her own chair, through the year they barely spoke because of a fight neither of them could remember starting. She had stayed because she believed, in the stubborn way people believe in things they've invested a decade into, that quiet wasn't the same as broken. On a Friday in March, the breath let go. She was watching the drawing on her phone, half paying attention while she folded laundry, the television murmuring in the next room, when the 6 number matched. Then she checked it again, and again. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to set the phone on top of the dryer and back away from it like it might go off, like it was something dangerous instead of something wonderful. She stood in the doorway of the laundry room for almost a full minute, staring at the pile of towels she'd been folding, trying to remember how to be a person who did ordinary things. $85 million. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub and laughed until she couldn't breathe, the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere underneath the disbelief. And then she called Richard, who was working late, again, and told him, in a voice that came out steadier than she felt, to come home. Right now. Don't ask why. Just come home. He arrived 40 minutes later, tie loosened, looking irritated in the particular way he'd taken to looking irritated whenever his evening was interrupted. That irritation lasted exactly as long as it took Elena to hand him her phone and watch his face change. That night he cried real tears, held her so tight she felt his heart slamming against his ribs, and told her this was going to change everything. She believed him. She should have listened more closely to how he said it. Change, she would learn, is not the same as improvement. It only means that things stop being what they were. The ticket had been purchased on Elena's card from an account she'd kept in her maiden name since before the wedding, a small independent checking account Richard didn't know existed, a habit from years of being careful with her own money, a leftover instinct from a childhood where her parents had fought about finances more nights than not. But when the lottery office called 2 days later to explain the claims process and asked whose name would appear on the paperwork, Richard had leaned over her shoulder, taken the phone gently from her hand, and suggested, in his most reasonable voice, that they file it jointly. For tax purposes, he said. It'll be simpler. It's ours anyway, isn't it? Elena, still dizzy with joy and trust, and the particular euphoria of having her entire life rearranged in a single evening, had signed the paperwork without reading every line. It felt like a technicality, a formality between two people who'd built a life together. It was not. The weeks that followed moved at a strange, disorienting speed. There were meetings with a wealth advisor Richard had already found before Elena finished her first cup of coffee the morning after. There were calls from a real estate agent about a property on the coast that Richard described with growing enthusiasm as an investment. There was a car, sleek, silver, absurdly expensive, that appeared in their driveway one afternoon with a bow on it that Richard had ordered as a surprise for himself and framed unconvincingly as a surprise for both of them. Elena watched all of it happen with a strange numbness, telling herself that this was simply what winning looked like, that people changed under pressure of good fortune the way they changed under pressure of bad, and that Richard would settle, eventually, into being the man she recognized. He did not settle. If anything, something in him seemed to sharpen, the way a knife sharpens against a stone, quietly, gradually, until one day it's simply capable of cutting in a way it wasn't before. 3 weeks after the drawing, 3 weeks of lawyers, financial planners, a new house in escrow, a car Richard had already picked out for himself, he sat her down at their kitchen table with the manila folder and told her, in the same reasonable voice he used for everything now, that he wanted a divorce. "I've felt this coming for a long time," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The money just... it made things clear." Elena sat very still. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something, and she found herself focusing on that sound instead of the one coming out of her husband's mouth, because it was easier, for a moment, to think about a duck than to think about the sentence that had just ended her marriage. What became clear to Elena in the days that followed was that things had a name. Danielle, 29, a marketing associate at Richard's firm who had, according to the emails Elena found on the family laptop late one night when she couldn't sleep, been clear about her feelings for over a year. The emails were not especially imaginative. They talked about a future in the vague, hopeful language of people who believe a future is owed to them. They mentioned travel. They mentioned a house with a pool. Reading them, Elena felt less like a betrayed wife and more like an accountant discovering an error in a ledger she trusted for years without checking. Richard didn't just want a divorce. He wanted her gone, cleanly and quickly, before the money had time to feel like anything other than his. He'd already spoken to a lawyer, a shark named Preston Hale, who specialized, according to the confident sans serif font on his website, in asset protection for high net worth individuals. Preston had a photograph on his homepage of himself standing in front of a sailboat that Elena suspected he did not own. Within a week, Elena was served papers, actual papers, handed to her by a stranger on her own front porch while she was still wearing her salon apron, claiming the lottery winnings as Richard's separate property. The argument, dense with legal language she had to read 3 times to understand, was that the claim had been filed under a joint account whose management Richard had initiated, and that Elena's original contribution, her $20 a week, her 11 years of small private hope, had been, in the language of the filing, incidental. He gave her 30 days to vacate the house. He did not offer her a dime. "You'll land on your feet," he told her, almost kindly, as if he were doing her a favor by saying it, as if kindness could be delivered in the same breath as abandonment. "You always do." Elena packed boxes in a house she had chosen the paint colors for. She packed the mug she used every morning, the photographs Richard hadn't bothered to ask about, the notebook with the sketch of a porch she'd never told anyone about because she'd never quite believed she'd get to have it. She did not cry in front of him. She saved that for the car, alone, in a parking lot 3 blocks from a rented studio apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking. But Richard forgot what Preston Hale, for all his $600 an hour billing and his frame law degree and his photograph in front of someone else's sailboat, never bothered to check, was where Elena actually lived. Not on paper, not on the deed, where she had actually legally once resided. Not the house on Ashford Lane, the one they'd bought together 8 years ago, and where Richard now planned, with a speed that bordered on indecent, to move Danielle in before the ink on the divorce was even dry. He forgot the state line. 6 years earlier, Richard's job had briefly relocated them 90 miles east, across the border, into a state with community property law. The kind of law where nearly everything acquired during a marriage, no matter whose name sits at the top of the paperwork, is treated as belonging to both people equally. They'd lived there for 14 months, in a small rental with a leaking gutter and a landlord who never answered his phone, before Richard's company moved them back. 14 months in which Elena, out of the same quiet loyalty that had kept her folding $20 into lottery tickets for over a decade, had kept a small storage unit in that state, renewed her library card there, registered to vote there, and, critically, never fully severed her legal residency, because Richard himself had told her, at the time, not to bother. "We'll be back before anyone notices," he'd said, already halfway through packing his study, already thinking about the next thing. Elena had believed him then, too. For weeks after the divorce papers arrived, Elena moved through her days like someone underwater, functioning but muffled, showing up to cut hair and smile at clients and drive home to an apartment that didn't feel like hers yet. It was her sister, Carla, who finally sat her down one evening with a legal pad and said the thing that changed the shape of everything that followed. "You keep saying he took it," Carla said. "Stop saying that. Start finding out if he's actually allowed to." Elena had a folder too by then. Hers didn't have Richard's confidence in it. It had patience and a growing quiet fury that she was careful not to let show to anyone but Carla, and eventually to the woman who would become her lawyer. She found Marisol Ortiz through a friend of a friend, a family law attorney with a small office above a bakery, a woman built entirely out of quiet, devastating competence. Marisol did not make promises in that first meeting. She made lists. She asked Elena for 6 years of bank statements, old leases, voter registration records, anything with an address on it, and she read through all of it with the unhurried thoroughness of someone assembling a puzzle she already suspected had a picture worth finding. It was on the fourth read of Richard's own divorce filing, the one his $600 an hour lawyer had drafted, that Marisol found the line. A single sentence, buried in a section about tax residency that had nothing to do with the lottery claim at all, where Preston Hale had listed their last shared marital domicile as the address in the eastern state. He'd used it to support an unrelated argument about deductions, never imagining anyone would connect it to anything else. He had, in trying to save Richard a few $1,000s on a tax technicality, accidentally told a court in writing, under penalty of perjury, that the marriage had been legally domiciled in a community property state during the exact window the winning ticket was purchased. Marisol read that line twice. Then she smiled for the first time since Elena had walked into her office. "He just told a community property court that your marriage was legally domiciled in a community property state," she said, tapping the page, "during the exact window the ticket was purchased. Elena, do you understand what that means?" Elena didn't, not fully, not yet, but she would. Revenge, Elena learned over the months that followed, does not look like the movies. It doesn't look like a confrontation in a restaurant or a slammed door or a clever line delivered right before someone storms out. It looks like folders. It looks like certified mail. It looks like showing up 10 minutes early to every meeting and saying almost nothing, letting the silence do the work that shouting never could. While Richard moved Danielle into the Ashford Lane house, the one still legally half Elena's, a fact his lawyer hadn't bothered to catch either, so focused on the money that the house had become an afterthought, Elena and Marisol built their case with surgical, unhurried care. They didn't leak anything to the press, though Marisol gently mentioned, more than once, that they could. They didn't threaten. They simply filed, on the 90th day, a countersuit invoking the community property statute, supported by 11 months of documentation that Richard's own legal team had, without realizing it, helped assemble. Richard found out the way most careless people find out things: too late, and from someone else. Preston Hale called him at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, and by 7:15 Richard was calling Elena, his voice climbing an octave with every sentence, the reasonable tone gone entirely, replaced by something closer to panic. "This is insane," he said. "This is... Elena, you can't do this. That money is mine. I won that." "You didn't win anything," Elena said, and she was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded, calm as still water, calm as a person who has had a very long time to imagine this exact conversation. "I did. You just forgot to check whose name was actually on the winning ticket before you had me sign it over." He hung up on her. He called back 4 times in the next hour. She let all 4 calls go to voicemail, made herself a cup of tea, and did not listen to a single one of them that day. The hearing took place in early autumn, 6 months after the numbers had come up on Elena's phone in the laundry room, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and fluorescent light. Richard arrived with Preston Hale and a new watch that caught the light every time he adjusted his cuff, a nervous habit Elena had never noticed in 19 years of marriage, but that seemed, suddenly, to define him completely. Danielle sat 2 rows behind him, in a blazer that looked expensive and uncomfortable, visibly unsure whether she was still supposed to be there, glancing at the exits more than once. Marisol laid it out simply, methodically, the way a person disarms something dangerous, piece by piece, without ever raising her voice. The original purchase, made on Elena's private account, documented by 11 years of consistent, identical transactions at the same gas station, the same amount, the same day of the week. The joint filing, initiated at Richard's own suggestion, a fact confirmed by the lottery office's own intake records, which listed him, by name, as the one who had requested the change to a joint claim. The marital domicile, legally established in a community property state during the purchase window, a fact Richard's own filing had inadvertently confirmed in writing. The Ashford Lane deed, still half in Elena's name, still requiring her signature for any sale or transfer, a signature Richard had never actually obtained before listing Danielle as a resident of a house that was, as far as the county was concerned, only half his to offer. Preston Hale objected several times. Each objection was overruled, and each overruling seemed to take a little more air out of him, until by the final hour he was simply sitting very still, writing nothing on his legal pad. Richard's face went through several colors during the proceedings: red, then a strange gray, then something closer to white. None of them were good ones. The judge did not take long. Under the law of the state where the ticket had, legally, been claimed during a still valid marital domicile, the winnings were determined to be community property. An even split minus what Richard had already spent, which the court ordered clawed back, dollar for dollar, from his remaining share. He didn't get Danielle's promised apartment fund. He didn't get to keep the sports car outright, in the end trading it for a smaller settlement he could actually afford. He very nearly didn't get to keep the house at all, and only did because Elena, when offered the chance to force its sale, said something that surprised even Marisol, who had come to expect very little that surprised her anymore. "Let him keep it," Elena said. "I don't want anything of his. I want what's mine." Elena walked out of that courthouse in early autumn light with $42 million. Her name legally restored to every account Richard had spent 6 months quietly trying to scrub her from, and something she hadn't expected to feel at all: lightness. Not triumph exactly. Not the fireworks and confetti feeling she might have imagined back before any of this started, if she'd ever let herself imagine winning against someone she'd loved. Just lightness. the particular relief of setting down something heavy she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She didn't buy a mansion. She didn't buy anything, at first, for almost 2 months, letting the number in her account sit there while she figured out who she wanted to be now that she had the freedom to decide. Eventually, she bought a small house on a hill outside town with a wraparound porch, the kind she'd sketched in the margins of notebooks for 20 years and never quite let herself want out loud, the kind of house that existed in her mind long before it existed in any listing. She opened the salon she'd always talked about and never had the capital for, Vasquez and Company, a name she chose for the simple, defiant pleasure of it being entirely hers, and hired 6 stylists, 3 of them women who had, in the intake interviews, mentioned in passing that they were rebuilding after bad marriages of their own. She didn't ask for details. She just gave them chairs. She funded a scholarship in her mother's name at the community college where her mother had once dreamed of taking night classes and never had the time or money to start. She traveled, slowly and without an itinerary, to the places she'd circled in old magazines for years. A coast in Portugal, a market in Mexico City, a small town in Italy where she stayed for 3 weeks longer than she'd planned simply because nothing was calling her back. Richard, for his part, lost his job 8 months later when the affair with Danielle became office knowledge in the particular, unstoppable way these things travel, and the firm's new leadership decided a public scandal, one now attached, however loosely, to a viral court case, wasn't worth the liability of keeping him on. Danielle left not long after that. It turned out, according to the version of events that eventually reached Elena through the small gossiping machinery of a town that size, she'd been rather more interested in $85 million than in Richard himself, and considerably less interested in a smaller, embarrassed version of him with a legal bill and a bruised ego. Elena heard secondhand, through a former neighbor who mentioned it almost apologetically, that Richard was renting a 2-bedroom apartment across town and driving for a delivery app on weekends to cover the difference. She felt, when she heard it, almost nothing. Which was, she realized later, standing on her own porch with a cup of tea and a view she'd chosen herself, the real victory. Not the money, though the money mattered, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that. Not the house on the hill, though she loved it fiercely, in the quiet, proprietary way you love something you built out of the wreckage of something else. The nothing. The absence of anger where anger used to live. The simple fact that his name, once the center of every decision in her life, had become just a name again. Small, ordinary, no longer capable of taking anything else from her. A year to the day after the numbers came up, Elena stood behind the counter of Vasquez and Company, sweeping the last clippings of the day into a dustpan while the late light came gold through the front window, when a woman came in for a walk in trim and mentioned, making small talk while Elena draped the cape around her shoulders, that she'd read something online about a lottery divorce case that had gone viral in legal circles. Some husband who tried to cut his wife out of a jackpot and lost everything because of a technicality nobody saw coming. "Can you imagine?" the woman said, settling into the chair, watching Elena in the mirror. "Forgetting something like that?" Elena smiled, picked up her scissors, and began to work, the familiar rhythm of it settling into her hands the way it always had, the one part of her life that had never needed to change to make her happy. "People forget all sorts of things," she said. "The trick is making sure it's never the thing that matters."